How romantic it must be to get imprisoned in a castle and me to squeeze out to heirs.
Hey guys, Pete here. But who can presume to know the heart of a dragon? This is something that Archmaester Gildain, the fictional character who wrote the fictional account of House Targaryen in Fire and Blood, said a couple of different ways talking about things their dragons do. After this episode, you could certainly apply this question to the characters, or perhaps in relation to Daemon. Who could presume to know what's going on inside this guy's head? He's been crowned the King of the Narrow Sea, which is also the name of episode 4, and after doing what he set out to do in the Stepstones, he's decided to bring his particular brand of chaos back to King's Landing. That provides fertile ground for the show to do some character development that those of us who read ahead know will pay dividends later, and an episode that's almost as hard to watch as it is beautiful. It provided answers to some questions that the source material left readers to ponder, and I'll be getting into everything that happened and why I liked it so much right after I warn you about spoilers. If you haven't watched House of the Dragon's 4th episode yet, then this video won't be for you. I will be referring to the books, the show Game of Thrones, and the history of this world, but I won't be revealing any future spoilers that I know about by reading ahead. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. The episode opens with the Princess of Dragonstone's world tour to find a proper match. This is something that Viserys set up because he wanted her to have a choice in who she married. And based on the two candidates we see at Storm's End, pretty much anyone who thinks they might have a remote chance is making their case. We meet an old man from House Dondarrion. You'll remember that name from the original series from the character Beric, who Ned sent to hunt down the mountain and then later became the resurrected leader of the Brotherhood Without Banners. His ancestor mentions their estate Blackhaven, and that is where Criston Cole's father worked as a steward. When he's talking about it, she brings up his meeting her great-grandmother Queen Alicent there 50 years ago, which is good for a laugh and also makes it clear that she's not interested in someone who's older than her father. The next non-age appropriate candidate is younger than her, and she's not much interested in him either, but does at least crack a smile when he tells her that he'll protect her. This young man is from House Blackwood, and we see him get heckled by someone from House Bracken, where things escalate until violence breaks out. The feud between these two families is something that's ongoing and always sort of in the background in the Riverlands. As the young man points out here, the Blackwood family is tied to the First Men. They're the only family in that area that worship the old gods, and they have what has to be one of my favorite sigils with the weirwood tree on it. Plus, it's a name worth remembering because there are some memorable characters that come out of this house in the future. In the books, there's mention of a duel between a Samuel Blackwell and Amos Bracken at this time, but based on the way this ends, I'm not sure that it's supposed to be a one-to-one adaptation. Either way, the violence sets things in motion and she decides to leave and go back home 2 months early. And on the way there, she sees that Daemon has also returned when Caraxes buzzes her ship. Something I noticed they're doing this season, which I didn't mention in last week's video, is illustrating this idea of the physical presence a dragon has in space. I like how they lean into that here as they sort of hit the deck as it flies by. And speaking of presence, the look on Viserys and Rhaenyra's faces as they await Daemon in the throne room speak volumes about the way his being there has potential to stir things up. He comes in wearing a crown, which Viserys takes issue with as the king would, but after he bends the knee, handing over that and the stepstones, his brother warms up. It's fun to watch everyone hold their breath as he's walking with Blackfire, and they're sort of waiting for him to actually welcome him. And you know that deep down, even though Daemon makes things difficult, this is exactly what Viserys wants. Corlys is sailing home, and Daemon returning to King's Landing brings up the question Viserys asks. Who's holding the stepstones? And apparently it's no one. But with the crab feeder and his army wiped out, they won't be shaking anyone down for the time being. There is a question because he was backed up by the Triarchy of how they feel about this, and we'll have to wait and see if the show brings that up again. As mentioned, Viserys is pumped up to have his brother back in town, and actually appears to be happy, which is rare. He brings the cold shoulder when Rhaenyra tries to join their conversation because he's not happy that she ditched the tour. And when Alicent tries to smooth things over, he gets obnoxious. There's a subtle touch here that I think really justifies switching out the actors for these roles when they get older. I've seen a lot of people saying they're going to really miss these actors, which is understandable, but I think this is a decision that makes sense. In this sequence, we're looking at the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms and its future heir. They're dressed for their respective roles at court, decked out in the best that money can buy, and even though they look fantastic, they still resemble the kids we met in the early episodes because we have moved ahead 4 years in the timeline by now. And if you think back to Storm's End and the Blackwood and Bracken dispute, with a sword in his hand, the kid in that situation was fully capable of gutting his tormentor. These are capable characters who have a lot more agency than their lower class counterparts, but they're not fully formed adults. Not yet. And so I like that there will be that distinction in somebody else playing the role when they get there. Because that's the case, Rhaenyra can be impulsive and in that way a frustrating young woman making decisions based just on what she wants and can get because of who she is, but can also have some legitimate issues with the situation she finds herself in. Alicent makes a fair point that most people in this world don't get 2 suitors, let alone essentially every eligible bachelor in the kingdom. And Rhaenyra levels a fair response saying they aren't fawning over her. They just want her name and bloodline to raise the stature of their houses and their offspring. When she jests about how romantic it must be to get imprisoned in a castle to squeeze out heirs, that hits a little too close to home for the queen. And there's a great shared reflective silence here just before she asks how angry her father is. He is pretty angry, but this conversation is more about each of their roles not really fitting. So even at the top of the food chain, you can understand that things are not ideal. Before they part ways, we get a brief indication that some part of their old friendship still exists when Rhaenyra says, "I've missed you too," and grabs her hand. And this makes me wonder about the scene that they apparently cut from the last episode, where Rhaenyra helped Alicent get ready for her wedding. Some of the images from that popped out online this week, and as I mentioned, it does make you wonder because of these time jumps. It's a little hard to see where these two are at in their relationship. In High Valyrian, she has a conversation with her uncle, who she hasn't seen for a very long time. He tries to explain to her that marriage is only a political arrangement and that once she does her duty, she'll be free to do whatever she wants because she was born a Targaryen. She points out that for women, there are other things to take into consideration because marriage can be a death sentence like it was for her mother. On the plus side, Rhaenyra is actively sitting in on the small council meetings now, and there we learn that Corlys has plans to marry his daughter to the Sea Lord of Braavos' son. That would mean that the crown would have to seek out a marriage pact of their own to neutralize any threat from his naval power. This would mean that Lionel Strong had the right idea and that she would have to marry Laenor, which based on the look she makes doesn't appear to be something she's interested in. When she goes back to her room, she finds a bag with a disguise and instructions. She finds the entry point to one of Maegor the Cruel's secret passages that we saw Varys and other characters use in Game of Thrones. And when she makes it outside, she finds Daemon there waiting for her. He takes her on what starts out as an exciting night on the town, which is cut with Alicent taking care of a crying baby, bathing her husband who is having some problems based on the sores we see, and then getting called to his room for some passionless sex late at night. Rhaenyra has some legitimate fun and even runs into Harwin Strong, who seems to be on board with keeping her secret, and she sees a mummers show where the crowd is convinced that baby Aegon would be the better choice to be their ruler. It's notable that she says that what they want is of no consequence, but all of this is overshadowed when Daemon takes her inside one of the brothels, where he also takes off her hat to reveal her Targaryen hair and blows up her whole disguise. He explains to her that this is where people come to take what they want, and this is all a continuation of what they were talking about before. He talks about pleasure and them being able to sleep with whoever they want, and then things get intense where he starts to get her going, taking their relationship to a brand new level, but then he leaves before things go all the way. He leaves her there and she gets spotted on the way out, and we'll see this kid who works for Viserys take the information to Otto for a reward. When she gets home, her personal protector, Criston Cole, is surprised to see her outside the room, and she gets the idea to invite him in. In a really thoughtfully put together scene, we see that she initiates the process of him becoming her lover. How this all played out was one of the biggest questions I had about the early part of Rhaenyra's story, and as I mentioned in my trailer video last week, based on Fire and Blood's format of relying on these different unreliable perspectives, it really was up in the air. And without going back into all of that, I'll just say that I absolutely enjoy how they played with that to the point that you can see how those different versions would come into being after being filtered through the perspectives of those different chroniclers. And again, I think it was all put together really well. I appreciated how Criston sort of paused at each of the multiple steps involved in getting out of his armor to point out that he does have honor. He realizes the potential mistake he's making by breaking his oath, but at the same time, he can't muster up what's necessary to deny her. There's certainly been hints that it was going that way, especially in the third episode, and so I think there's enough there that you can see that they have a connection. Daemon wakes up in a flea-bottom room that's been arranged by Viserys, and I absolutely love the way that how he got there and how much he knows about what she's up to is left open for interpretation. Was this something he set up to try to turn his brother against Otto? Or did he just go out and get loaded and then she capitalized on the moment? It's something I've been thinking about since I first watched the episode and honestly can't say for sure either way. I also loved her line that hard lessons are not welcomed, but suffered. Things are still icy between them after what we saw play out at Dragonstone. She mentions that she left the skin trade behind, and we do see her collect her payment for the information from Otto, and then she tells him he can pay for the room on his way out. Before he takes that information to the king, you see that Otto has a moment in his chambers where he isn't sure. He goes to him, and it's interesting that when he hears that she was in a pleasure house, he doesn't seem to mind that part at all. But then Otto explains that it was more than that. When pressed, he says that she was seen with her uncle Daemon in the bowels of a pleasure house, and then adds coupling after a dramatic pause. Viserys gets defensive and calls him out for his ambition of wanting his own blood on the throne so badly that he would destroy his. Then he sends him away, and since she spent the night in his chambers, Alicent overhears the whole conversation. She calls for Rhaenyra and they have a conversation in the Godswood. She asks her if she did the deed with Daemon, and when Rhaenyra says that it's a vile accusation, she responds that the Targaryens do have queer customs, and Daemon certainly knows no limit. What's fascinating here is that of course she has to downplay what really happened, and she can tell her honestly that they didn't have sex, even though it seems obvious that she would have if things went that way. So we see her spinning things around somewhat to reassure not only her friend but her ally, all while knowing that she did have sex with a member of the Kingsguard who was breaking his vows. And you see her implement some of the tools she has here because of her power. She's quick to point out people questioning the princess's virtue and spreading slanders in a way that most people wouldn't be able to. When Daemon wanders back in through the gates, he's escorted forcefully by the Kingsguard and left on the floor of the throne room. Viserys wants answers, but he never gives any, and lets every chance he's given to deny it pass right by. It's all a little maddening to watch until he proposes a plan that makes it all make sense. He tells his brother to give him Rhaenyra to marry as a way to solve his problem. He frames it in a way that it doesn't matter what people think because he's the dragon, and it's not hard for Viserys to see that it's not about Rhaenyra at all, but about the power she represents. It's a nice little echo of what she was saying to Alicent earlier. Daemon presents this as a way to return the House of the Dragon to its proper glory. His solution totally fits with what we've seen of the character, who, as I mentioned at the very beginning, does a lot of things that are hard to parse while he's doing them. A little bit later, when talking to Alicent, Viserys will ask, what does he gain by admitting to something he didn't do here? And while it's not clear if Daemon actually knows what he's trying to do, or if he's just rolling with the punches that come up because of the way his chaos kind of creates all these situations, he always lands on the side of trying to improve his position. In the end, the king sends him away again. And as mentioned, Alicent does go to bat for Rhaenyra. Viserys maintains that she's not innocent in this situation and that her and Daemon have the blood of the dragon, which makes them restless and chaotic. Still, Alicent is convinced by her friend. She swore to her that she remains a maiden and she believes her. When he finally talks to his daughter, he shows her Aegon's dagger, which we find out here also belonged to Rhaenyra Targaryen, which is interesting because his daughter Daenerys' dream is what got them to leave Valyria before the Doom. That's why they left, and subsequently is the reason that all Targaryens need to pay attention to their dreams and can't completely write them off. They literally wouldn't be here right now if they hadn't followed this one that their ancestor had all those years ago. We do see that Aegon added his prophecy to the blade so that when it's heated up, you can read it. And this is something else that I talked about in my trailer video, so I won't go back down that road. She does agree to wed Rhaenor, but only if her father removes Otto as his hand. She rightly recognizes that he will continue to be a threat to her becoming the queen, and if she was going to have to marry this guy anyway, then why not neutralize your political enemies in the process? Her father follows through with this. He calls Otto in and gives him his walking papers. There's another little lore dump here where he talks about his father and some of the stuff that was going on around the time of his death. He goes as far as saying that Otto may have been involved with that, but I think what stands out more here is that he says that he realizes that Alicent was a calculated distraction. He'll never get over losing his wife, and Alicent being there is what got him through to the other side. So it took him a little while to recognize what was actually happening there. And I love the mirroring here of Otto lying to the king in the same way that Rhaenyra was lying to Alicent. Of course, he was trying to get his grandson on the Iron Throne, and he did send Alicent as a calculated distraction. But at the same time, he did receive this information about Rhaenyra, and what was he going to do? Keep it from the king. And so his run as hand that started back in the reign of Jaehaerys has officially come to an end. And that means that we'll be getting a replacement for him in the next episode. And the episode ends with the Grand Maester bringing Rhaenyra moon tea. This is a concoction that exists in this world to prevent or abort pregnancies, and it kind of works as a punch in the gut for the princess because it means that her father doesn't necessarily believe that she didn't sleep with her uncle. So I really like this episode for multiple reasons. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking about TV, not just someone who has spent a lot of time inside this world, some of the things that had been bothering me, some of the nitpicky stuff that had been standing out in the past couple of episodes seem to be less prevalent here. Part of that could be because this is mostly a self-contained episode, and the chances they're taking here are mostly on the character level. Part of it could be because I prefer the style of this director as opposed to the one who did episodes 2 and 3. I thought the dialogue was sharp, and the actors all delivered in some interactions that were very layered. I've been high on the intentionality of what they've been showing us in the first 3 episodes, and this is where I'm starting to really love what they're doing with these characters. I don't think they can get us to a place where they are any more likable than they are right now. And I don't think it was ever going to be a problem to present them as flawed characters, but ones where you could at least understand what they're doing and for it to make sense based on the circumstances. But this week it felt like they can make them complicated in a compelling way. I'm a sucker for characters who can be 2 things at the same time because that's what real people are like. And some of the time that's a tough sell when you're dealing with people whose magic blood affords them the privilege of being royalty, and on top of that have their own personal nuclear option. I can be sympathetic towards Rhaenyra, who isn't being viewed as legitimate based on her sex, and the very real problems she confronts because of that fact. But it doesn't necessarily wipe all that other stuff away. The show seems to have that on its mind on some level, and I really appreciate that they made the point of her having legitimate fears about getting married and producing heirs in relation to what happened to her mother. This is not just a spoiled brat only concerned with doing what she wants to do. She is that, but also has real concerns that she might die fulfilling her duty. And then that all comes back around to the real problem of what happened in that room with her mother. Based on what we know about the character, she did view that as doing her duty, and possibly would have told them to go ahead with the C-section, but she was never given a choice. It was never her choice. Rather than an explanation about what was happening, even if it all might have been inevitable, someone else made the choice for her, and then they held her down while she experienced what could only be described as terror as she became a sacrifice. As far as the lore end of things, like I mentioned, getting answers to some of these questions was an absolute treat. It was also great to see Storm's End and a little bit of House Blackwood, who I am a big fan of. As a slight spoiler, I'll say that I think that the young man we saw there will actually be the father of a pretty important character that comes up much later. There's a ton of great foreshadowing in that way, and there's even a pretty revealing Easter egg that I won't point out. But I think it will be one of those things that when you go back, when you've seen the end of the series, you'll be like, oh well then, that was right there the whole time. The Daemon of it all is fascinating in a way that I didn't think it could have been. I mean, I knew this would be an entertaining character, but some of the stuff that happened in this episode really had me thinking. I mean, Viserys was spot on in him understanding that Daemon was interested in power. There are multiple things going on with all of that happened with Rhaenyra, but at the bottom of it all, he's looking for a way in. With the way that they used Mysaria in this episode, though, it's possible that he planned this out a lot more than I would have given him credit for, based on the character and some of the things that he does in the book. I don't think it's a spoiler to say he's going to play a big role in the rest of the series, and I do find myself more interested in what they might do with him, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this episode, and if you haven't read the book, where do you think things are going to go next? If you have read it, how do you feel about these answers we got this week and the additional characterization that they're adding and the way that they're filling in those blanks? Because for my money, they really are pulling it off right now, making this a much more satisfying story for TV. It's all right to talk about book spoilers in the comments. Just make sure you mark them so that it won't spoil anyone who hasn't read them. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.